The sun rose with a different kind of light that morning. It was as if even the sky knew it was going to be a special day. Raphael opened his eyes before the alarm even went off. His heart was beating faster, not out of fear, but from a quiet joy, the kind only someone who's truly been in love can understand. He lay there for a few minutes, just staring at the ceiling, like he was reliving an entire lifetime in a matter of seconds. He had prayed so many times for this day. He pictured this moment over and over, walking down the aisle, seeing his bride in white, his parents' teary eyes, his friends smiling from the church pews. Everything was ready. His suit was hanging neatly on the hanger, his shoes polished to perfection, and his vows, handwritten, rested on the desk. This was the beginning of a new chapter. A new family. A fresh start. Raphael got up slowly, took a deep breath, and smiled at himself in the mirror. There was something beautiful in his face. It wasn't the clothes or the haircut. It was the light in his eyes, the kind that comes from someone who waited patiently, who chose to love truthfully. He had always believed that love wasn't about rushing, but about being intentional. And now, everything he believed in was about to become real. In the kitchen, his mom was making a special breakfast. His dad gave him a strong hug, the kind you give your son one last time before he becomes a man at the altar. Every gesture, every word carried emotion. Everyone could feel that today was more than just a ceremony. It was a promise. The car pulled up. The driver was already waiting with a smile and a friendly pat on the back. Raphael slid into the back seat, straightened his jacket, held his vows in one hand, and touched his chest with the other. His heart was beating strong, full of faith. The church was less than 30 minutes away. Every mile felt like a countdown to the most important moment of his life. The radio played softly. Raphael stared out the window, watching the world go by with ease. It felt like nothing could go wrong. But what he didn't know was that, at that very moment, something unexpected was about to happen. Something that would change everything. Something that would make him see life through a different lens. If this story has already touched your heart, subscribe to the channel. Here, every story is a journey of faith, healing, and new beginnings. The car moved calmly along the road, and from the back seat, Raphael kept gazing out at the scenery, his heart at ease. The city looked more beautiful that day. The trees swayed with the wind, the sky was clear, and everything around him radiated peace. He closed his eyes for a few seconds and silently thanked God. It was one of those rare moments when the soul feels completely still. No doubts, no fears. Just the certainty of being in the right place at the right time. In his mind, he pictured his bride's face, smiling, walking through the church doors. He thought about the words he had written for his vows. He could feel this day would be etched into his memory forever. But sometimes, life changes course without warning. It happened on a simple curve, just minutes away from the church. A truck was coming from the opposite direction. Maybe the driver was distracted, maybe the brakes failed. All anyone heard was a loud noise, the screech of tires, and then, the crash. The light vanished. Silence fell instantly. Time, which had been gently moving forward, now felt violently torn from its path. The car was thrown against the side of the road. Raphael, unconscious, didn't feel a thing. The driver, injured, still managed to call for help. People ran toward the wreck, sirens wailed, and in moments the road turned into a scene of chaos and rescue. Raphael was rushed, unconscious, to the nearest hospital. The suit that had once symbolized joy was now torn. The vows he had poured his heart into were crumpled and stained. And the ceremony, the one that had been waiting for him, was halted before it could even begin. Back at the church, the guests waited. The music played softly. But time kept passing. The groom never arrived. The bride, anxious, tried to hide her growing fear. Then the phone rang. And with it came the news no one was prepared for. The man who was on his way to get married was now fighting to stay alive. The hospital lights were cold. The smell of antiseptic and the heavy silence pressed down on anyone who walked those halls. Raphael slowly opened his eyes, disoriented, his vision blurry and his senses scrambled. Everything around him felt distant, like he was waking up from a bad dream. It took a few seconds for him to realize he was no longer on his way to the church. The white ceiling, the beeping monitors, the muffled voices, he was in a hospital. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. His arm was immobilized, and a sharp pain shot through his leg. His head felt heavy, but worse than that was the sinking feeling in his chest, the emptiness of not knowing what had happened. A nurse walked in, speaking gently. She explained he'd been in an accident. The driver was okay, and they'd both been rescued quickly. But Raphael's condition needed attention, a fractured leg, scrapes and bruises, and a few weeks of recovery ahead. He closed his eyes. The image of the church came rushing back. The flowers, the friends, the altar. And then, what had been a fog of confusion turned into pain. A quiet pain that started deep inside and slowly took over his chest. It began to sink in. He didn't get married. He didn't make it. The day he had waited for had ended before it even began. Hours later, his parents arrived. His mother, eyes swollen from crying, held his hand like she was trying to pull him out of a nightmare. His father tried to be strong, but could barely speak. Raphael wanted to ask about his bride, but his voice gave out. The answer came in their eyes. She was in shock, they said. Shaken. She left shortly after getting the news. Asked for some time. Said she needed to think. And there, in that hospital room, surrounded by machines, tubes, and memories of a day that was supposed to be the happiest of his life, Raphael realized that a new kind of battle had begun. It wasn't about the broken bones anymore. It was about fighting the feeling that everything had fallen apart. On the outside, a wounded body. On the inside, a heart trying not to break. The days in the hospital crawled by. The routine was filled with tests, medications, and painful attempts to move his body. But for Raphael, the worst pain wasn't physical. It was the kind no medicine could fix. Her absence. Since the accident, he hadn't heard his fiancée's voice. No message, no visit, not even a sign. His phone had been destroyed in the crash, but his parents had tried reaching out through other ways. She replied only once, and her message was cold. She said she was confused. That she needed space. That she didn't know how to process everything. Raphael didn't want to pressure her. He understood the shock, the weight of it all. Neither of them had seen this coming. But deep down, he had hoped that the love they shared would be strong enough to hold on. To stay, even if afraid. Even without all the answers. But time passed, and she didn't come back. It was Raphael's father who gently broke the news. She had decided to call off the engagement. Said she didn't see herself walking that path anymore. That life had changed. That she wasn't ready to face a reality so different from the one she had dreamed of. Raphael listened quietly. He didn't cry then. He just closed his eyes and let the silence speak for him. The feeling of being left in his most vulnerable moment was too heavy to put into words. That night, after everyone had left and the lights were out, he cried for the first time since the accident. Not loud, not dramatic. It was a silent cry that came from the soul, from the deepest part of someone who loves and is left behind halfway through the journey. The pain of losing the wedding was real. But the pain of being abandoned while still fighting to stand again, that was even harder to bear. And there, in that hospital bed, with a broken body and a shattered heart, Raphael felt small. Weak. Forgotten. But what he didn't know yet was that the abandonment he was facing now would become the very ground where God would begin planting something new. After hearing the news that the engagement was over, something inside Raphael went dark. He was still breathing, still moving with effort, still responding to doctors and nurses, but inside, he was gone. Like everything that once made sense had been ripped away all at once. He spent hours just staring at the white hospital ceiling, unable to think about anything. He didn't feel anger. He felt empty. A soul-deep exhaustion that no medicine could fix. The questions came in waves, but no answers ever followed. Why did this happen? Why now? Why, God? His parents kept visiting. Friends slowly drifted away, not out of malice, but because they simply didn't know what to say. And truthfully, he didn't want to talk either. He didn't want advice or promises that things would get better. He just wanted silence. He just wanted to fall asleep and wake up on a day when none of this had happened. It was during this time that Raphael began to question his faith. His whole life, he had believed in a good God, fair, present. He prayed, he served, he helped others. And now, here he was, heartbroken and physically broken, asking, where is God when everything falls apart? The nights felt endless. The sounds of the hospital were louder in the dark. Footsteps in the hallway, nurses whispering, monitors beeping, all of it turned into memories. Memories of what never happened. Of what was cut short. Of what he lost. And that's how Raphael hit rock bottom. It wasn't a single moment. It was a buildup of silences. A mix of pain, abandonment, and darkness. He didn't want to die, but he didn't know how to keep living like this either. But rock bottom, no matter how dark, still has a floor. And it's right there, on that floor, that God begins to rebuild. Not in a rush, not with quick answers, but with patience. And with a love that never gives up. It was on an ordinary morning, one of those days where Raphael expected nothing more than the usual hospital routine, that something different happened. The nurse who came in to give his medication was new. He had a calm smile, an easy way of talking, and most of all, a peaceful look in his eyes. He didn't bring up faith right away. He just made small talk while checking the monitors, asked how Raphael was feeling, and mentioned there was something in the air that morning. Maybe it was just the sunlight finally streaming through the window after days of gray skies. But over time, with more visits, the conversations grew deeper. The nurse shared that he'd been through something similar once. He, too, had lost something he thought would last forever. He, too, had felt forgotten by God. Raphael listened in silence. He didn't respond with excitement, but he didn't shut down either. That familiar pain, spoken by someone who had made it through, touched something buried deep inside him. One day, before leaving the room, the nurse slipped a small note beside Raphael's bed. It wasn't a Bible verse or a sermon. Just a simple sentence. God hasn't left you. He's still writing your story. Raphael read it, and the tears came without warning. It was as if those words broke through a wall inside him. They didn't fix everything. They didn't erase the pain. But they opened a crack, a small sliver of light in a place that had known only darkness. From that moment, he started to respond. Little by little. He pushed harder during physical therapy, talked more with his parents, and one night, almost without realizing it, he began to pray again. Not with fancy words, but with honesty. It was a new beginning. Slow, imperfect, but real. And right there, in that hospital room where he thought everything had ended, life quietly began to be restored. Because when God rebuilds, He starts with what's most hidden, the heart. If you've ever been broken by life and still found strength in God, like this video and share your story in the comments. Your journey might be the answer someone else is praying for today. Months had passed since the accident. Raphael was no longer in the hospital, but he was still in recovery. He walked with difficulty, went through intense physical therapy, and carried a few scars on his body. But inside, something had changed deeply. The faith that once felt distant had now become a constant companion. He didn't talk to God like he used to, with rehearsed phrases. He spoke honestly, with raw sincerity, as if talking to someone who had stayed when everyone else walked away. It was during one of his rehab sessions that he met a younger guy, quiet, downcast, recently injured, and drowning in despair after losing part of his mobility. Raphael sat beside him and didn't say much. He simply shared a piece of his own story. He didn't try to cheer him up with cliches or empty promises. He just told the truth about what he'd been through, like opening his heart without filters. And the young man cried. Not from sadness, but from relief. Like someone who, for the first time, felt seen. That day, Raphael went home deep in thought. He realized that, without even meaning to, his pain had become a bridge that reached someone else's heart. And it reminded him of something he had once heard in the hospital: what you call a wound, God can use as a ministry. He started visiting hospitals more often, talking to patients, offering his presence and his ear. Sometimes he shared a word. Other times, just silence. But in every visit, he left a little of the hope he had rebuilt inside himself. Over time, he began receiving invitations to share his story at gatherings, churches, and small group circles. And in every place he went, he always said the same thing. I thought the accident had ruined everything. But it was what showed me that God was still calling me to something greater. The wedding didn't happen. The plans changed. But the purpose, that was revealed through the pain. Raphael came to understand that he didn't need all the answers. He just needed to be willing to let God rewrite his story. Time passed, and a lot had changed. Raphael no longer walked with difficulty. His body still carried the marks of the accident, but his soul, that was stronger than ever. The memories of the wedding that never happened, the pain, the heartbreak, and the hospital, they hadn't been erased. But now, they were part of something bigger. They were no longer open wounds, they were scars that told a story of resilience and faith. One day, he was invited to speak at a conference about new beginnings. The auditorium was full, people sitting in silence, eyes fixed on him, hearts weary. He stepped onto the stage slowly, calmly. He didn't bring a polished speech, didn't try to impress. He simply brought the truth. He shared how he had been on his way to get married. He talked about the crash, the hospital, the heartbreak, and the rock bottom. And most importantly, he talked about what came after. About reconnecting with God. About the new purpose. About how pain, when placed in the right hands, can become healing. At the end, he looked out at the audience and said something that stayed in everyone's heart. I didn't make it to the altar that day. But I arrived somewhere I never would have known if everything had gone as I planned. God didn't take me where I wanted to go, He took me further. After the talk, many people came up to him. Some cried. Others simply said thank you. But every single one of them had been touched in some way by what he had lived through. Today, Raphael continues his journey. He still believes in love. He still dreams. But now, he understands that what truly carries us through life isn't the plans we make, it's the trust we place in a God who sees beyond what we can. The road that once seemed like it ended turned out to be a path. And the altar he never reached was just a detour to a greater destination. If this story spoke to you, subscribe to the channel. Sometimes, God doesn't take us where we wanted to go, because He's leading us exactly where we need to be.